How the Jewish claim to Palestine is historically and religiously false. Chapter 4. This chapter will cover the prophets Dawood and Suleiman, when and where they lived, and will explain what historic characters the Bible's David and Solomon were based on. To conclude the first part of our story, chapters 1 to 3, we see the prophets Ibrahim, Yaqub, Yusuf, and Musa in Mesopotamia. The Pharaoh of the Bible and the Quran was in southern Iraq, not today's Egypt, and the mythical Joshua entering Jericho with the 12 tribes was based on the story of Sargon I, who was accompanied by 5,400 people on a war footing, who conquered the lands between the Euphrates and the Nile, fulfilling the promise Allah made to the prophet Ibrahim. The mythical story of the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah in Palestine was based on the true story of the two kingdoms of Akkad and Sumer, created by the armies of Sargon I during the 3rd millennium BC. The true Israelites were the Akkadians, not the Jews who settled in Palestine in the mid-1st millennium BC. What evidence do we have for where the prophets Dawood, David, and Suleiman, Solomon, lived? And are the Bibles, David and Solomon, based on the real prophets named Dawood and Suleiman in the Quran? Or were the biblical scribes describing other Akkadian rulers who they falsely named David and Solomon? For that, we have to look more closely at the Quran and the archaeological record. The Quran says, "We bestowed grace aforetime on Dawood from ourselves. O you mountains, sing you back the praises of Allah with him, and you birds, and we made the iron soft for him. Make coats of mail, balancing well the rings of chain armor, and work righteousness, for be sure I see all that you do." Dawood was living in a mountainous terrain filled with birds. He also had access to iron, which would have come from the Taurus Mountains in Turkey. The Taurus Mountains were rich in minerals and metals, and it was there that metallurgical technologies had their beginnings. Iron was being shaped on a limited basis as early as 2000 BC, coinciding with the 3rd dynasty of Ur. It was here that the manipulation of iron had its beginnings. The Sumerian plain did not have natural resources like metals. Copper came from Iran, Anatolia, today's Turkey, and Arabia. Trade is what sustained the economy, with traders bringing goods along the Euphrates and Tigris from the Taurus ranges. The first use of metals, including bronze and sophisticated ways of casting, emerged in Mesopotamia. The technology was mainly used with copper, lead, tin, gold, and silver. The word for smelter, furnace, as found in the Bible, in Leviticus, which Dawood would have needed to mold his iron, is believed by scholars to have been Akkadian in origin, borrowed by the Sumerians. The later Hebrew words developed from the Akkadian originals. Eventually, the skill of iron smelting spread to Syria and other parts of Mesopotamia, culminating in the Iron Age, which was 1150 to 900 BC. Dawood could not have lived in Palestine when he was shaping iron. The biblical time frame puts their David in Palestine during the Iron Age, when iron smelting was common and did not need divine assistance to create it. As we shall see, when the kingdoms of Akkad and Sumer collapsed during the early 2nd millennium BC, the knowledge of iron spread to other nations that they were related to. One was the Hittites, who were known for their mastery and monopoly of iron and their use of chariots in warfare. The Assyrian kings of the 1st millennium BC protected the knowledge of ironworking from their enemies and smuggled it from former Hittite and Hurrian lands into Babylonia. The purchase of iron became an illegal practice. The style of defensive armor that Dawood made, namely coats of mail with rings of chain armor, eventually spread to many semi-nomadic tribes who emerged from the mountainous regions of Iran over the 1300 years that followed the fall of the kingdoms of Akkad and Sumer. All the tribesmen were known as equestrian archers whose cavalry wore armor similar to those of the Scythians, 700 to 300 BC, with overlapping scales made of iron and a combination of iron and bronze, giving the equestrian rider flexibility of movement. They used coats of mail with rings of chain armor in their defensive attire, and their societies were semi-nomadic and pastoralist. Among them were the Sarmatians, who were related to the Scythians and spoke a language related to Persian. They roamed the lands between China and Hungary. Other related tribes were the Morsi, Siracis, Yazigis, Roxolani, Sauromatai, and the Alans. Eventually, the technique of armor production spread to the Greeks, and the Scythian weapons have been found among the Germans and Mongolians. The prophet Suleiman was known for his love of horses and horse breeding. Behold, there were brought before him at eventide coursers of the highest breeding and swift of foot. And he said, Truly do I love the love of good, with a view to the glory of my Lord. Until the sun was hidden in the veil of night, bring them back to me. Well, the domestication of the horse began in southern Russia around 3200 BC. Equestrian skills, however, began towards the end of the 3rd millennium BC, somewhere in the highlands of Iran. The skills of harnessing, training, and riding horses commenced sometime after Sargon I's dynasty established their empire. What Pharaoh used in warfare were chariots, but they were driven by oxen or donkeys, as was found in the royal cemetery of Ur. Here we see a photo of the Scythians. The overlapping scales of armor emerged from the mountainous region of Iran. Equestrian skills emerged from the mountainous region of Iran. By the mid-2nd millennium BC, there were many warriors who used the defensive armor invented by the prophet Daud. The image we now have is of equestrian riders who clearly had knowledge of horse training that Suleiman was known for, wearing coats of mail with rings of chain armor that Daud invented, emerging from the mountains of Persia. Like Daud and Suleiman, these societies were semi-nomadic and were pastoralist. The Egyptian historian Manetho wrote the history of his people around 300 BC. Manetho was an Egyptian priest, fluent in Greek, and wrote 3 books, the history of Egypt, or Egyptiaca, using ancient Egyptian records. Manetho said the Beni Israel arrived in Egypt from elsewhere, not Palestine. He said they were tribal Bedouin sheikhs, Arabian shepherds, who left their lands at a date so remote in the past that it preceded the Trojan War by nearly 1,000 years. Archaeologists believe Troy fell around 1184 BC. 1,000 years earlier would have been the period when the warriors of Sargon's dynasty of Akkad were still sweeping throughout the Near East and invading Egypt, where they turned their world upside down. What else does the Quran tell us about Daud and Suleiman? And to Suleiman we made the wind obedient. Its early morning stride was a month's journey, and its evening stride was a month's journey. And we made a font of molten brass to flow for him. And there are jinns that worked in front of him by the leave of his Lord. And if any of them turned aside from our command, we made him taste of the penalty of the blazing fire. They worked for him as he desired, making arches, images, basins as large as reservoirs, and cauldrons fixed in their places. Work, you sons of Daud, with thanks, but few of my servants are grateful. The violent wind flew tamely for Suleiman to his order to the land which we had blessed. These inventions of Suleiman take us to the time and location when they were a novelty, or first invented. The description is definitely not the 10th century BC in Palestine, according to the biblical time frame, since by then all these inventions were commonly known and did not need jinns to help create them. All these inventions could be found in the temples in Akkad and Sumer, after the dynasty of Sargon I, during the period of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. Shrines were built with rooms for ablution. There were baking ovens and storage jars. There were vats, bowls, brick-built drains. Priests most likely lived in these rooms with arched recesses built into the walls where images and statues would be placed. In the temple of Bursin, there was a hall of justice in it, as well as a smelting furnace, with evidence that copper and other metals were melted there. In the temple of Ningal, there was a paved floor sloped to a drain, an ablution place, an area one could call the Holy of Holies, a stepped altar where statues and sacred vessels could be placed. There were rooms with sacrificial vessels and a brick bitumen-proofed water tank. There were arched doorways that led to a sanctuary. The mausoleums of Ur III had all the features of Suleiman's inventions. They showed an understanding of plumbing so one could create stationary basins and cauldrons. There are words in the stories of Daoud and Suleiman in the Hebrew Bible that show an origin from the Sumerian or Akkadian. One such word is foundation platform, that Suleiman was said to have prayed on. Scholars who have studied the origin of Hebrew words argue that the Hebrew word was adapted from the Sumerian. Others believe the word developed from the Akkadian to the Aramaic and was then adapted into Hebrew. The word for iron in the Hebrew is closer to the Phoenician, an Ugaritic word, as opposed to the Aramaic and Akkadian term. There are many words in the Hebrew Bible that take us to the original Akkadian and Sumerian, and all these words refer to the period of the prophets Yaqub, Daoud, and Suleiman. According to Mankowski's study, out of 170 biblical Hebrew words from all the Old Testament texts that are considered loan words from ancient languages that preceded Hebrew, 85 are Akkadian, 35 are Babylonian, and 50 are Assyrian. Even some of the biblical Hebrew names of months can be traced to Akkadian roots, such as the Akkadian Adar, which was Hebrew Adar, Dumuzi, Elulu, Hebrew Elul, Kislimu, Hebrew Kislev, Nisanu, Hebrew Nisan, Simanu, Sabatu, and Tebetu. Besides the overwhelming connection to Sumer and Akkad found in so many biblical Hebrew words, we know the related words also indicate ancestral ties with the second millennium BC nations that rose to power after the kingdoms of Akkad and Sumer fell apart. Some of the nations were the Hittites, the Hurrians, Urartians, Aramaeans, Elamites, Babylonians, Ugarit, and the Assyrians. During the second millennium BC, all these nations used Akkadian as a common language between them, even though they had their own languages. Akkadian was the lingua franca of the entire Near East after the conquest of Sargon I, united the lands between the Euphrates and the Nile. More will be explained about the Beni Israel as we follow their lives during the second and first millenniums BC, and explain how some of them ended up in Palestine, with today's Jerusalem as their capital. To continue with the Quran's surahs about the prophets Daoud and Suleiman, Quran says, "And remember Daoud and Suleiman when they gave judgment in the matter of the field into which the sheep of certain people had strayed by night. We did witness their judgment. To Suleiman we inspired the right understanding of the matter. To each we gave judgment and knowledge. It was our power that made the hills and the birds celebrate our praise. With Daoud it was we who did all these things. It was we who taught him the making of coats of mail for your benefit, to guard you from each other's violence. Will you then be grateful? And remember our servant Daoud, the man of strength, for he ever turned to Allah. It was we that made the hills declare in unison with him our praises at eventide and at break of day. And the birds gathered in assemblies all with him did turn to Allah. We strengthened his kingdom and gave him wisdom and sound judgment in speech and decision." Has the story of the disputants reached you? Behold, they climbed over the wall of the private chamber. When they entered the presence of Daoud, and he was terrified of them, they said, "Fear not, we are two disputants, one of whom has wronged the other. Decide now between us with truth, and treat us not with injustice, but guide us to the even path. This is my brother. He has 99 ewes, and I have 1. Yet he says, 'Commit her to my care,' and is harsh to me in speech." Daoud said, "He has undoubtedly wronged thee in demanding your ewe to be added to his flock of ewes. Truly many are the partners in business who wrong each other. Not so do those who believe and work deeds of righteousness, and how few are they." And Daoud gathered that we have tried him. He asked forgiveness of his Lord. He fell down bowing and turned to Allah in repentance. So we forgave him this lapse. He enjoyed indeed a near approach to us in a beautiful place of return. "O Daoud, we did indeed make you a vicegerent on earth. So judge you between men in truth, nor follow the lusts of your heart, for they will mislead you from the path of Allah. For those who wander astray from the path of Allah is a grievous penalty, for that they forget the day of account." The temples in Akkad and Sumer were known to keep large flocks of sheep and goats. King Shulgi of the third dynasty of Ur held 350,000 in 1 year, according to the tablets. They also had cattle and animals used for sacrifice and divination. Daoud was a vicegerent, Khalifa, or Caliph. He was the chief religious and political ruler of his people. Since no known list of religious lead rulers was discovered in Akkad and Sumer, we would not find Daoud's name. The Sumerian king list gives all the known kings who ruled during the period, and there is no mention of Daoud and Suleiman. There were judges in some temples in Sumer, and their role was to hear the petitions of their people. The judges would be in audience chambers of the rulers, and each petitioner would wait his turn to speak to the judge. The temples that were on elevated terrain were surrounded by walls, so petitioners could approach in an orderly fashion. If the decision of the judges was not satisfactory to the plaintiff, he could appeal to a person in a higher position, and could even approach the king and ask him to give a judgment. In the Quran story of Daoud, it seems the petitioners were not satisfied with the decisions of the judges, and perhaps they climbed the wall of the Khalifa Daoud's chamber, startling him, since this was obviously not the proper course of action. Being the highest religious authority, they must have valued his opinion. Not knowing the case details, he seems to have rushed to judgment and regretted it later. Kings did get involved in agricultural and commercial activities, overseeing the large number of shepherds and herdsmen who were in charge of the kingdom's income. Their decisions must have held great weight. For matters of religion, there were the temples and the judges. The Sumerians were known for their variety of sheep and legal cases involving the ownership of sheep. Examples of biblical-style laws could be found in Mesopotamia as far back as the late 3rd millennium BC. A large number of cases involving shepherds and their lost sheep can be traced to the 3rd dynasty of Ur. During Ur III, there were officials of the court who processed the cases and saw to it that punishment was met. Legal contracts were sometimes written and other times were made orally before witnesses in the courts, who affixed their seals on the tablets. Criticizing the Bani Israel who abandoned faith at the time of Musa, the Quran tells us, they followed what the evil ones gave out falsely against the power of Suleiman. The blasphemers were not Suleiman, but the evil ones, teaching men magic and such things that came down at Babylon to the angels Harut and Marut. But neither of these taught anyone such things without saying, we are only for trial, so do not blaspheme. We are given an exact location for Suleiman. He was in or near Babylon. And we made subservient to Suleiman the wind blowing violently by his command to the land which we had blessed, and we know all things. This land, Akkad and Sumer, was clearly the blessed land, the original promised land, not Palestine. And of the evil ones were some who dived for him and did other work besides, and it was we who guarded them. The reference is to pearl diving, a skill known since the time of the Sumerians. And Suleiman was Daoud's heir. He said, O you people, we have been taught the speech of birds, and on us has been granted a little of all things. This is indeed grace manifest from Allah. And before Suleiman were marshaled his hosts of jinns and men and birds, and they were all kept in order and ranks. From a Persian miniature showing the jinn helping Alexander the Great build his Gate of Gates. The stories of the jinn were well known in Mesopotamia and Persia. The jinn were frequently portrayed in Persian artwork. At length, when they came to a valley of ants, one of the ants said, "O you ants, get into your habitations, lest Suleiman and his host crush you underfoot, without knowing it." So he smiled, amused at its speech, and he said, "O my lord, so order me, that I may be grateful for your favors, which you have bestowed on me and on my parents, and that I may work the righteousness will please you, and admit me to your grace to the ranks of your righteous servants." And he took a muster of the birds, and he said, "Why is it I do not see the hoopoe, the el-hudhud? Or is he among the absentees? I will certainly punish him with a severe penalty. or execute him unless he brings me a clear reason for his absence. But the hoopoe tarried not far. He said, I have compassed territory which you have not compassed, and I have come to thee from Sabah with tidings true. This is the hoopoe. I found her and her people worshipping the sun, besides Allah. El-Shaitan, the Satan, has made their deeds seem pleasing to their eyes and has kept them away from the path, so they receive no guidance, that they should not worship Allah, who brings to light what is hidden in the heavens and the earth and knows what you hide and what you reveal. Once again, they were in a mountainous terrain filled with birds. In the story of the Queen of Sabah, we are told that the hoopoe bird discovered her kingdom. The hoopoe, el-hudhud, bird was always indigenous to Iraq. The Sumerians were also known to be sun worshippers and were known to have queens leading their men. This was not Yemen, as so many people mistakenly believe. The story of the queen being in Yemen was invented by the Jewish scribes who wrote the biblical stories. If their King David and his son Solomon lived in Palestinian Jerusalem, then Yemen must have been where the Queen of Sheba lived. The Jewish scribes who wrote the biblical stories claimed their David and Solomon lived in Palestine around the 10th century BC. Archaeologists have found absolutely no trace of such kingdoms anywhere in Palestine, and no evidence of any Queen of Sheba in Yemen. The Quran's descriptions contradict every fabricated story in the Bible. The descriptions of the terrain that the prophets Dawood and Suleiman lived in is nothing like Palestine. Suleiman had pearl divers working for him, also mentioned in Surah Sad. The biblical stories describe Suleiman using pearl divers to enhance the beauty of his temple or palace. Pearl divers did not exist at any time off the coast of the Mediterranean and were not known to dive in today's Red Sea. Suleiman was obviously close to the Persian Gulf. Suleiman asked Allah to grant me a kingdom which suits not another after me, for you are the granter of bounties. Then we subjected the wind to his power to flow gently to his order, whatever he willed, as also the evil ones, every kind of builder and diver, as also others bound together in fetters. The heritage of pearl diving goes back thousands of years in the Gulf. The pearls come in a myriad of colors whose luster and translucency are famous. The Sumerian tablets refer to them as fish eyes, indicative of how ancient the love of pearl diving was, particularly along the eastern shoreline of the Arabian Peninsula and near Kuwait. In the story of the Queen of Sabah, she was sent a letter by Suleiman to come to him in submission and accept the religion of Allah. Without giving the detailed story of the contacts between them, the queen finally visited Suleiman and was diverted from the worship of others beside Allah, for she was of a people that had no faith. She was asked to enter the lofty palace, but when she saw it, she thought it was a lake of water, and she tucked up her skirts, uncovering her legs. He said, "This is but a palace paved smooth with slabs of glass." She said, "Oh my Lord, I have indeed wronged my soul. I do submit with Suleiman to the Lord of the worlds." When Suleiman asked for a kingdom that suits not another after me, that means it was unique. It could not have been like others unearthed by archaeologists throughout the Near East. The Bible's descriptions of the palace of Solomon match those that existed in northern Syria in the 9th century BC during the time of the Omrid dynasty in Palestine. As the Jewish scribes were composing their Bible, they used examples of buildings that existed during their time period. What do the above surahs tell us? Suleiman was extremely devout, and unlike other kings and rulers of the Akkadians who came with Sargon I, he never followed the pagan gods that the Akkadian people continue to follow. He and his father Dawood most likely lived during the period of Ur III, towards the end of the 3rd millennium BC. Because they never turned their backs on the true faith, it is hard to find them in the archaeological record. We can only find them through their inventions, the terrain they lived in, and the hints that are in the Quran. Suleiman invented glass, so it was a complete novelty during his time, causing the queen to be so captivated that she readily submitted to Allah. Rabbinic literature also states that Suleiman had a house made of glass. The Hebrew word for glass is believed to have come from the Akkadian, and the term was later adapted to Aramaic and Biblical Hebrew. The earliest sample of glass was found in ancient Sumer, dated to the period after the conquest of Sargon I and his dynasty of Akkad. It is evident that the knowledge of glassmaking was known during the third dynasty of Ur. Ancient texts dating to the later Assyrian Empire of the first millennium BC reveal a reverence for the original glassmakers, with religious rituals like sacrifices made to honor their memory prior to producing the glass. Terminology used in the art of glassmaking is in the bilingual text dating to Hammurabi's reign in the early part of the second millennium BC. Those texts have Sumerian and Akkadian versions. One from Nippur was written in Sumerian and predates the others to the period early in the second millennium BC. Anzahu glass appeared as part of the inventory of a member of a wealthy government employee during the third dynasty of Ur. The inventory lists it as 1 bowl of Anzahu glass, its weight being 55 shekels. Part of the translucent glass rod of light, the blue-green color, was excavated at Shnuna. At Eridu, a lump of very bubbly opaque blue glass was found dated to the beginning of the third dynasty of Ur, about 2100 BC. A group of scholars, A. Leo Oppenheim, Robert Brill, Dan Barak, Axel Soldern, studied the ancient recipes for producing glass and compiled the results of their remarkable work in a book, Glass and Glassmaking in Ancient Mesopotamia, published by the Corning Museum of Glass Press. Since Anzahu glass was dated to the third dynasty of Ur, Oppenheimer and his colleagues wrote that Anzahu glass as material for containers represents the earliest phase in the complex history of Mesopotamian glasses as reflected in the written record. The scholars followed the recipes preserved in ancient Assyrian texts to recreate the glass of unexpectedly high quality, entirely transparent but had a pale blue color. As Lee Oppenheim states, we have no means of finding out under what stimulus or where in the ancient Near East this technological breakthrough occurred. Later glass items dated to the 15th or 14th centuries BC found in Assyrian sites gave the impression that they were blown glass, a skill that was previously believed to have been invented much later in Near Eastern history. Eventually, the art of glassmaking spread to various parts of the Near East. As Oppenheim states, there was a rather abrupt disappearance of glass after the 11th century BC, and very few glass artifacts have been unearthed in Palestine, most of which are considered to be imports. Suleiman's palace was definitely not in Palestine at any time in history. Evidence points to Ur as the location for the first sample of glass. We can conclude that Suleiman lived there or in that vicinity. Suleiman had asked Allah for a kingdom that was unique, making and shaping glass so that the palace had a glass floor, light blue in shade, so it resembled a body of water, would have taken extraordinary skills over 4,100 years ago. The heating, cooling, blowing process would have required controlling the wind, and perhaps that is why it is mentioned in the Quran surahs. Glass palaces were never unearthed anywhere in the Near East, only items made of blown glass in the second and first millenniums BC. All the texts relating to glass and glassmaking were found in Mesopotamia, not Palestine. Some were found in Ur, others near cities that were part of Akkad further north. As you can see them where the arrows are, it shows you the 4 locations there where they found the texts relating to glass and glassmaking. If we advance to the period of Alexander the Great, Dhul Qarnayn of the Quran Surahs Al-Kahf, there were writings about his life produced by scholars of later periods. There was one story that Alexander traveled to Babylon towards the end of his life, and there he looked for the wonders which Suleiman had made, and apparently was directed to the city where he had lived. The many legends of the Beni Israel all describe Suleiman in Mesopotamia, not Palestine. Clearly, there was a contradiction between what the Bible says and what the scholars of the Beni Israel were saying. In Persia, during the time of Cyrus the Great, many of the buildings were named for Suleiman. Where was Saba? It is often referred to as in Yemen, and the Sabaeans were in Yemen, but I have shown photos of the Sabaeans in the marshes of Iraq. The Quran states there was for Saba aforetime a sign in their homeland, 2 gardens to the right and to the left. Eat of the sustenance provided by your Lord and be grateful to him, a territory fair and happy and a Lord often forgiving. But they turned away from Allah, and we sent against them the flood from the dams, and we converted their 2 gardens into gardens producing bitter fruit and tamarisks, and some few stunted lote trees. That was the requital we gave them, because they ungratefully rejected faith, and never do we give requital except to such as are ungrateful rejectors. Between them and the cities on which we had poured our blessings, we had placed cities in prominent positions, and between them we had appointed stages of journey in due proportion. Travel therein secure by night and by day. But they said, O Lord, our Lord placed longer distances between our journey stages. But they wronged themselves. At length we made them as a tale that is told, and we dispersed them all in scattered fragments. Verily in this are signs for every soul that is patiently constant and grateful. The cities that Allah poured his blessings on were clearly in Akkad and Sumer. If Suleiman was in Akkad and Sumer, then Saba could not have been in Yemen. The hoopoe flew a short distance to find the queen. He did not fly from southern Iraq to Yemen and back. The description is an area of rivers, dams, lush gardens, and some distance away from city-states like the ones that existed for millennia in Mesopotamia. The Arabic word for dam is arim, which could also mean embankments. The image is then of an overflowing river bank that would surely destroy gardens. The lote tree is an ancient term for lotus trees. Saba was known for its tamarisk and lotus trees that were severely damaged from overflowing rivers. The tamarisk is a bush that is salt-tolerant and can be found in areas like Dasht-e-Kavir, the salty desert terrain of north-central Iran. It is also found in other parts of Iran, particularly the province of Khuzestan in western Iran. In southern Iran and Pakistan, in the vicinity of Sistan and Baluchistan, there are remnants today of what must have once been forests of tamarisks. The lotus tree is also indigenous to the area. The province of Khuzestan in western Iran. This is a map showing how close it is to the Blessed Lands. Dasht-e-Kavir can be seen in north-central Iran. The map shows central and eastern Iran and Afghanistan that were known as part of the Silk Road. In pink are Pakistan and its province of Baluchistan. The Makran Desert is in southern Iran and Pakistan. The Zagros Mountains can be seen extending from northern to southern Iran. The hills and birds described in the Quran suit this area the most. The tribes that emerged from this region, that went east to Mongolia and west to Europe, all wore the armor that was invented by the prophet Dawood. In ancient Persia, the flowers from the lotus tree were carved in floral motifs and friezes along the stairways of the palace of Darius in Persepolis. Prior to that, the Assyrians also used the lotus motif in decorations, which are evident at Nimrud, perhaps a practice of cultural borrowing. However, it is in Persia that we find the greatest use of the lotus as decoration on palace walls, since the lotus tree is indigenous to Persia. Out of 9 known species of lotus trees found in the world, every one of them can be found in Iran. In southern Iran and Pakistan, Baluchistan alone dates back to the 3rd millennium BC. To sum up all the descriptions of the lives of the prophets Dawood and Suleiman, take us to Mesopotamia and the mountainous regions of western Iran. The queen of Saba was in Sumerian territory. They all inhabited a land that was abundant with birds, with the hoopoe being specifically named in the story of Suleiman and the queen. The species is still abundant in Iraq. The lotus, the tamarisk, all indigenous to Persia. The horses, the invention of glass, the pearl diving, the invention of indoor plumbing, arches, vessels for ablution and cooking were all part of the inventions dated to the 3rd dynasty of Ur. Dawood's smelting of iron, the creation of the armor with coats of mail, all emerged from the mountainous region of western Iran. The angels, jinn, were all part of Mesopotamian history. More evidence will take us to the region and time period of Akkad and Sumer. As we shall see, the biblical stories of David and Goliath were based on Mesopotamian history. The Jewish scribes altered the names, but some of the stories are similar. Why does the Bible describe the prophet David as a king who defeated the invading Philistines in Palestine, killing a huge man named Goliath? Before I dissect the Jewish version of the story, let us turn to what the Quran tells us. Have you not turned your vision to the chiefs of the Bani Israel after the time of Musa? They said to a prophet among them, "Appoint for us a king that we may fight in the cause of Allah." He said, "Is it not possible if you were commanded to fight that you will not fight?" They said, "How could we refuse to fight in the cause of Allah, seeing that we were turned out of our homes and our families?" But then, when they were commanded to fight, they turned back, except a small band among them. But Allah has full knowledge of those who do wrong. Their prophet said to them, "Allah has appointed Talut as king over you." They said, "How can he exercise authority over us when we are better fitted than he to exercise authority? And he is not even gifted with wealth in abundance." He said, "Allah has chosen him above you and has gifted him abundantly with knowledge and bodily prowess. Allah grants his authority to whom he pleases. Allah is all-embracing and he knows all things." And their prophet said to them, "A sign of his authority is that there shall come to you the Tabut, Ark of the Covenant, with an assurance of security from your Lord and the relics left by the family of Musa and the family of Harun, carried by angels. In this is a symbol for you if you have faith." When Talut set forth with the armies, he said, "Allah will test you at the stream. If any drinks of its water, he will not go with my army. Only those who do not taste of it go with me. A mere sip out of the hand is excused." But they all drank from it except a few. And when he and the faithful ones with him crossed the river, they said, "This day we cannot cope with Jalut and his forces." But those who were convinced that they must meet Allah said, "How often, by Allah's will, has a small force vanquished a big one? Allah is with those who steadfastly persevere." The real name for biblical Goliath was Jalut. When they advanced to meet Jalut and his forces, they prayed, "Our Lord, please pour out constancy on us and make our steps firm. Help us against those that reject faith." By Allah's will, they routed them, and Dawood slew Jalut. And Allah gave him power and wisdom and taught him whatever he willed. And did not Allah check one set of people by means of another? The earth would indeed be full of mischief. But Allah is full of bounty to all the worlds. The translator of the Quran made the serious error of writing Goliath instead of Jalut, since he equated the Quran story with a distorted story of David and Goliath in the Bible. In the above surahs, the king was Talut, not biblical Saul, and Dawood killed Jalut, not Goliath. The Babylonian Akkadian word talu was a young date palm. Talut's name was most likely Akkadian. To know what time period this was, I read the Bible's version of the story. Upon close examination, it became apparent that there were events similar to this during and prior to the Ur III dynasty of Akkad. So one has to deduce that the story of Dawood and Jalut took place within that time frame. However, contrary to the Quran story, the Bible story is one of treachery and backstabbing between the kings of the Bani Israel who ruled at the time. Recall in the Quran story, the Bani Israel rejected the prophet they were given by Allah because he wasn't wealthy and powerful, revealing how they liked to portray their rulers. As a substitute, the Jewish scribes who wrote the Bible replaced the humble, God-fearing prophets in the real story with ones who were more to their liking, namely characters in their history who were wealthy and powerful, but pagan. Daoud criticized his own people for rejecting faith, so he and Suleiman could not have been the characters described as David and Solomon in the Bible. Who were the biblical writers remembering when they described their stories of these two prophets? Continual warfare characterized the dynasty of Sargon I, which was necessary to conquer the lands between the Euphrates and the Nile. In their two kingdoms, Akkad and Sumer, they built temples to the pagan gods of those they conquered, established governments that connected the various settlements in their kingdom, and they asserted their Akkadian Semitic language over the Sumerian one. Battles were ongoing in order to preserve Sargon's kingdom of Akkad from foreign invaders named the Guti, plural Gutians, who arrived from the western Zagros Mountains. It is believed they came from Lake Urmia and or Azerbaijan. They were most likely the ancestors of today's Kurds. This is a map dated to 1876 showing Kurdistan in northern Mesopotamia, north of it Armenia, within the Caucasus Mountains. This is an old map showing Azerbaijan and Armenia in the Caucasus Mountains. It shows the two lakes, Van and Urmia. The Guti were a long-time menace to the Akkadians, who regarded the barbaric hordes as a punishment from the god Enlil. They had invaded Sargon's city of Agade, controlled the areas around Umma, and lived there for 50 years, soaking in Sumerian culture while stealing and pillaging. The Guti attacked the temples of Nippur, Erech, Kish, and Adab. During those years, Akkad became a shadow of its former self. Finally, the Akkadians and Sumerians put together a campaign to oust the Guti from their lands. The Guti were finally evicted from their lands by a coalition of city-states led by Utuhegel of Uruk, 212 to 2004 BC. Utuhegel and his son died in battle and was replaced by Ur-Nammu of Ur, Ur 3. Ur-Nammu rebuilt the great ziggurat of Ur and many of the temples in his kingdom, such as areas in northern Syria and today's Mosul, in Nineveh. The stories found in the biblical narrative, written in Jerusalem about 1,500 years later, drew on the history of the Israelites in Mesopotamia during the Guti years. In 2 Samuel, the Philistines in the biblical story that allegedly took place in Palestine were actually named the Gittites, a clue to who they were thinking of when they erroneously inserted the Philistines as the barbaric hordes who attacked their two kingdoms. Having experienced the invasions of 5 groups of people collectively known as the Sea Peoples at the end of the Bronze Age, one of whom was the Philistines, the scribes in Jerusalem inserted them into their story instead of the Guti. In the Bible story, it was the Philistines who stayed in Palestine and tormented the Bnei Israel. In Akkad and Sumer, it was the Guti who stayed and tormented the Akkadians. The stories parallel one another. Let us look at each story that describes the battle between the Akkadians and the Guti. Below each biblical story is the parallel Akkadian story. Towards the end of Sargon's dynasty of Akkad, Utuhegel was governor of Uruk. He finally ousted the Guti from the lands of Akkad and Sumer. Ur-Nammu was his son-in-law, who became governor of Ur. In the parallel story, Utuhegel matches biblical Saul, and Ur-Nammu matches biblical David. Biblical David wanted to prove himself in battle. Ur-Nammu wanted to prove himself in battle. Biblical prophet Samuel chose David as his choice in battle. King Saul disapproved of the choice. Biblical Saul reluctantly trusted David. Utuhegel reluctantly trusted Ur-Nammu. Biblical Saul's battles against the Philistines were legendary. Utuhegel's battles against the Guti were legendary. Biblical Saul accused David of plotting against his realm. Utuhegel accused Ur-Nammu of plotting against him. Biblical Saul and his son died in battle. Utuhegel and his son died in battle. Biblical David allegedly took over Jerusalem and Palestine and united both Israelite kingdoms. Ur-Nammu took over as governor of Ur, uniting both Akkad and Sumer, despite the objections of the northern Semitic capital of Kish. Biblical David brought prosperity to Judea. Ur-Nammu brought prosperity to Ur. Biblical Saul was from Kish. Kish was in Mesopotamia, not Palestine. According to the Sumerian king list, written in 2100 BC, Kish was the first city to have kings after the flood. The first ruler listed in the king list was Etana of Kish, who might have ruled early in the 3rd millennium BC. Kish was the oldest city in Akkad. It can be seen east of Killa. You can see it on the lower end. The Bible says King Saul was from the tribe of Benjaminites. Well, during the 18th century BC, there was a tribe mentioned in the Mari letters out of 20,000 clay tablets found at Tel el-Hariri, located along the central Euphrates in today's Syria. The Mari letters were written by the Amorites. They were the Banu Yamina, possibly meaning children of the right. They are believed to be the Benjaminite tribe of the Bani Israel. The original Benjaminites were in Mesopotamia, not Palestine. They were living among the Amorites. There was also a group of people described as the Habiru along the Euphrates and are believed to be the Hebrews. Mythical Saul was not in Palestine, but his history was based on the history of Utu-Hagel, the governor of Uruk in Akkad, who might have been from the Benjaminites of Mesopotamia. Why did the Bible name the prophet Samuel instead of the Quran's Talut? Well, the biblical writers probably remembered the name Samuel of Larsa, who conquered Kish during the first dynasty of Babylon, 1897 to 1883 BC, and being so good at distorting history, they replaced one name with another. More parallels. Biblical David rebuilt the Jerusalem temple on previously established Jebusite structures. He captured the land from the Jebusites. Biblical David built his temple in Jerusalem that was made up of terraces. Well, Ur-Nammu rebuilt his ziggurat over previously constructed smaller ones, and the ziggurat of Ur was a 200-foot wide, 70-foot high temple tower, which was also made up of terraces. Biblical David moved to Hebron and made it the principal town of the southern Judeans, but he made Jerusalem his religious capital. Ur-Nammu made Ur the principal city of southern Sumer, but made Nippur his religious capital. Biblical David married a Jebusite woman who gave birth to his son Solomon. Solomon succeeded David. Ur-Nammu had a son named Shulgi who succeeded him. The story of biblical David and Solomon was based on the story of Ur-Nammu and Shulgi. Biblical David and Solomon constructed many temples throughout Israel and Judah, dedicated to many gods, pagan gods. Together they commenced a large program of rebuilding their kingdom. And when David died, Solomon completed his father's temple expansion projects. Well, in a parallel story, Ur-Nammu and Shulgi constructed many temples throughout Akkad and Sumer, dedicated to many pagan gods. Together they rebuilt Ur. And when Ur-Nammu died, Shulgi continued his father's projects. Biblical Solomon established a seaport at Ezion-Geber at the entrance of the Red Sea. Shulgi established an important seaport at the entrance of the Persian Gulf, once known as the Red Sea. Biblical Solomon was known for his wisdom and justice. Shulgi wrote the Code of Laws, from which centuries later the Amorite Babylonian king Hammurabi would develop his laws. Laws were also codified in Essene, Nippur, and Erech. Biblical David and Solomon ruled during one of the most prosperous periods in Israelite history. Well, Ur-Nammu and Shulgi ruled during one of the most prosperous periods in Akkadian history. Shulgi introduced new weights and measures, reorganized his kingdom, enlarged the civil service, and established scribal schools throughout. These two rulers remained in the minds of the Bani Israel as the most successful of their rulers. Biblical David married a Jebusite woman, giving birth to Solomon. According to the Semitic linguist Edward Lipinski, the Jebusites were a tribe or clan related to the Amorites. The only mention of them was in a cuneiform tablet found at Mari along the upper Euphrates, and they were referred to as the Yebusiyun. That places them in Mesopotamia, where the prophet Daud was. In the Bible, the prophet Ezekiel, possibly Dhul Kifl in the Quran, confirmed to the Beni Israel that they were related to the Amorites and therefore the Jebusites, the Yebusiyun. The great lawmaker of the early 2nd millennium BC, Hammurabi, was an Amorite from Babylon. Being related to the Beni Israel, his code of laws was most likely similar to the original laws given to the prophet Musa. The story of biblical David and Goliath is another example of how the scribes in Jerusalem altered their history and claimed all the stories of the Beni Israel happened in Palestine during the 1st millennium BC. The story of Goliath in the Bible says Goliath was a Gittite from Gita. He allegedly fought against David, and David's nephew killed him in Gath. There was an alleged battle in Gob with the Philistines, and a Bethlehemite killed the brother of Goliath. There is no evidence that such stories happened in Palestine. There are parallel stories in Akkad, when the Akkadians were fighting the Guti. Who was Goliath? The name in the Hebrew Bible is Goliath. Well, the story was most likely based on the history of Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, 224-6 to 2190 BC, who fought against the Guti. Naram-Sin defeated the Guti king Gulayan. Naram-Sin gave him amnesty and released him to return to his land. But according to the writings of Naram-Sin, King Gulayan joined "He who is not flesh nor blood, verily he is." While parts of the text are missing, it could be a reference to a warrior who is inhuman in some way. Gulayan consulted oracles in the Amanus Cedar Mountain and returned again to fight the Akkadians. He attacked at night stealthily and killed large numbers. In the various stories that describe David in the Bible, he lived in mountainous regions and had to protect his flocks from lions, bears, and other wild animals. There is no evidence that lions and bears lived in Palestine. The Babylonian and Assyrian kings were known for their hunting of lions. Assur-nasir-pal claimed to have captured 15 lions and 50 lion cubs for his zoo, which he proudly displayed to his people. Assyrian kings are shown in reliefs on their palace walls going on lion hunts. The lions of Iraq and Iran are now extinct. An ivory panel showing a lioness devouring a man in a lotus thicket, dated to the 8th century BC Nimrud. An Assyrian king killing a lion. Assyrian kings hunted lions. Biblical David was victorious in the mountains. 1 Samuel is filled with descriptions of the Beni Israel living in mountains. The Jebusites lived in mountains. Samuel was born on a mountain. The Beni Israel had to cross large rivers to get to the mountains where their enemies lived. In their wars, they pitched camps on mountains. Gideon, Deborah, Barak of the tribe of Naphtali, Samson, all the major characters in the biblical stories lived in the mountains. The descriptions do not match Palestine, but are more like the Zagros Mountains of western Iran. Biblical David came across an animal named a reem in the mountains. The reem has an Akkadian origin as a rimu, meaning a wild ox that is now extinct. The rimu was native to the Zagros Mountains. The images from both the Quran and the Bible should be clear by now that the true stories of the patriarchs, from Ibrahim to Suleiman, were in Mesopotamia and western Iran, not Palestine. Recall the words in the Quran that the Beni Israel began distorting Allah's message from the time of Musa. About the Jews who wrote their own book. They changed the words from their right times and places. It is not Allah's will to purify their hearts. For them there is disgrace in this world, and in the hereafter a heavy punishment. They took all the stories out of the correct chronology and location. Now we can see that. There is a legend that is known by some Iraqis that Suleiman was near Mosul, in the mountainous region east of Mosul. The city of Nineveh was near there. Nineveh, situated on the Tigris, was highly populated, and one of the oldest cities of the Assyrian Empire. Its location would have been perfect for prophets like Dawood and Suleiman, who had access to iron, horses, and all the products they used that are mentioned in the Quran. They were in mountains filled with birds and wildlife like lions, bears, and the reem. Daud also fought the Guti in those mountains. Nineveh was situated along important trade routes. It traveled north-south and east-west. The land was very fertile, being close to a tributary of the Tigris. I followed the evidence to arrive at these locations for the original stories of the prophets. It was after I wrote my first book that I realized the Mandaeans, one of the sects that lived in the marshlands of Iraq, had written in their priestly texts that the Exodus actually took place in southern Iraq, confirming my research. It was local legends that led Sir Leonard Woolley to excavate the royal cemetery of Ur. One cannot discount legends. In every legend, no matter how far-fetched it seems, there is a kernel of truth. The map shows Nineveh to the east of Mosul in Iraq. South of it is Nimrud. Mosul is in the northwest, along the Tigris River. In the east is the city of al-Sulaymaniyya, one of the many possible locations for the prophet Suleiman. Dawood and Suleiman would have had access to the trade routes, going east and west, horses from southern Russia, iron from the Taurus Mountains, the materials needed for inventing glass from Afghanistan. Dawood was fighting the Guti in the Zagros Mountains, a terrain filled with rivers, birds, wild animals. His invention of coats of mail as defensive armor emerged from these mountains and could be found in later years in Mongolia in the east and Germany in the west. The trade routes passed through Afghanistan, where the ingredients needed for the invention of glass could be found. The Silk Road would have taken the Israelite tribes and those related to them as far as Kashmir and the Indus Valley. The Pashtun tribes of Pakistan and Afghanistan claim to be descendants of the tribes of Jacob. These are structures discovered at Gezer, in today's Israel, ancient Canaan. They are dated to the early 10th century BC. Biblical archaeologists in Israel are still guessing where their mythical Solomon lived. The latest guess is that maybe these were produced by Solomon because they date to the biblical time frame of the 10th century BC. There are no mountains, and the terrain does not match the biblical descriptions or the Qur'ans. To conclude, the prophets Dawood and Suleiman were never in Palestine. Archaeologists who keep digging in order to prove that Jerusalem was the city of David have had no success in proving that myth. Next is chapter 5. That will take us to the 2nd millennium BC. The great Israelite lawmakers gave details of the laws of Musa, which were very similar to the laws we find in the Quran. We will also see the Israelites scattered throughout the Middle East, where they were rulers of powerful nations. We will see how they broke all their covenants and were duly punished with the first punishment mentioned in the Quran, and subsequently utterly destroyed.